I wanted to make another video about so-called pseudo-autism. Olga Bogdashina is describing this in her book, and it needs to be really distinguished. You can't just say autism is trauma-related. That's just not true.
When I adopted, I knew that, there may be issues, because when you adopt, just like when you have a baby yourself, you do not know how that baby is going to turn out. So we did not know what Alex was going to be like when we got her. When I got her at the orphanage, she did something that I was not aware that it even had a name. It's called the Orphanage Rock. And evidently for babies that are in an orphanage that are not getting any attention and need to have a way to soothe themselves or comfort themselves if they've been hurt or they're hungry, they learn in the orphanage that crying and doesn't really get them anywhere. So it took Alex a very long time to even cry. For, I would say, several weeks, she sat, and I'll do my little imitation if you don't mind me doing. Here's my imitation of Alex. Fresh from the orphanage, Alex would sit and she would chew her clothes and rock back and forth and make noise. So she would go,
Really?
Yes.
Oh gosh.
Yes.
What this lady just described appears to be like autistic stimming. However, it is not the same. There is a difference. Stimming is self-stimulatory behavior, also known as stimming and self-stimulation. The repetition of physical movements, sounds, words, or moving objects. Such behaviors are common in people with developmental disabilities and are particularly frequent in people on the autism spectrum. People diagnosed with sensory processing disorder are also known to potentially exhibit stimming behaviors. Stimming has been interpreted as a protective response to overstimulation, in which people calm themselves by blocking less predictable environmental stimuli, to which they have a heightened sensitivity. A further explanation views stimming as a way to relieve anxiety and other negative or heightened emotions.
So that let us know right away that she was going to have some issues. We didn't know what they were. We didn't know if she was going to be autistic. We didn't know, but we could tell right then, the first night she was in my hotel room, that there were going to be issues with her, and she was not as far along developed as we thought she was going to be, and might in fact have some other issues that would need to be addressed.
So this is a quote by Olga Bogdashina, and I shared that already in August last year. And this points out the difference between true autism and pseudo-autism. Quote, early sensory deprivation and autism. What if sensory deprivation occurs very early in life? It can be caused either by hypoperception, closed senses when not enough stimulation comes in, or by self-imposed sensory deprivation when a child shuts down his or her senses to avoid painful experiences. We can see autistic symptomology in cases of sensory deprivation or sensory impairments, which are often described as quasi or pseudo-autism. The difference between true and pseudo-autism seems to be that recovery is possible from quasi or pseudo-autism if appropriate sensory stimulation is provided, in contrast to true autism where, despite stimulation, there is no complete recovery. Well-known examples of acquiring of pseudo-autism and recovering from it are young Romanian orphans adopted by UK families. Michael Rutter et al. 1999 followed the development of 165 Romanian babies, most under 12 months of age, in their adopted families. These children had suffered from physical and social deprivation in their home country, where they were kept in orphanages with minimum care and human contact. So this is the same what this mother described, who adopted this Chinese baby who had started to do that orphanage rocking to soothe herself because she didn't get any attention from the staff.
1998, when authors Robin Carr Morse and Meredith Wiley released the book Ghosts from the Nursery, they presented startling evidence that violent behavior is fundamentally linked to abuse and neglect in the first 2 years of life. Their book pushed forward a national discussion on how, why, and when society needs to intervene in child abuse and neglect cases. And it led the way for even more research on how abuse and neglect actually hardwire children's developing brains.
Reality is that a lot of parents are imbibing in things that aren't very helpful to their availability to that baby.
In the book, you build a connection between neglect and abuse in not only in the first 2 years of life, but also before the baby's born, in utero, and then after that, and then adult violent behavior. How did you start putting those chains together in that link?
I'm a family therapist, so I have certainly seen that in my own practice. If you look back to the very beginning, that cycle begins with babies born to families all across the world who are experiencing their first minutes with their babies, with mamas with bruises on her face or on her back, living quietly, submerged in angry or demeaning relationships, maybe parenting too soon. I mean, circumstances that we know. Mental illness is another programming of the limbic or the emotional system that happens very early in development.
This is the study about quasi-autistic patterns, about the Romanian orphans. 6% showed milder, usually isolated autistic features. Such autistic characteristics were not found in a similarly studied sample of 52 children adopted in the first 6 months of life within the UK. The children from Romania with autistic patterns showed clinical features closely similar to ordinary autism at 4 years, but they differed with respect to the improvement seen by age 6. The children from Romania with autistic features tended to differ from the other Romanian adoptees with respect to a greater degree of cognitive impairment and a longer duration of severe psychological privation. But this is not true autism. That's the difference.
That night, I did call my family doctor, who also happened to be my best friend, and I called her and I said, listen, I don't know what this is, because she is just rocking. I can't get her attention. She doesn't make eye contact when I try to feed her. I've got a little bowl of cereal, and I have to beat on the side of that bowl with the spoon to even get her attention, to have her look up. She's totally withdrawn.
Sometimes I'm still that way. I'm not gonna lie.
Get your attention. I was concerned back then, that has been some time ago. Once you left the orphanage, that baby was yours. Just like when you leave the hospital and you have a baby, that baby is yours. It comes out of your body. It belongs to you, whatever the issues are. And in China, when you leave that orphanage and you take that baby, that is your baby. So I knew at that point that whatever was going to happen with Alex, that I would provide that. My entire family pitching in, everybody helped Alex in one way or another. We had a very good friend who was a pretty well-known child psychologist in Columbus that sent one of her people over to do a total evaluation of Alex and basically said, she appears to be physically healthy. She's just really far behind developmentally. So she's going to have a lot of help learning she doesn't crawl, she doesn't stand up, she has lower body, doesn't have much muscle mass. So we're just going to have to work on that. But they gave us some advice, and that advice was every day counts. So every single day she made progress. And I can't imagine taking this child from an orphanage where the child had been abandoned. Who knows how this other little boy had been abandoned, but oftentimes in China, they're either abandoned in the woods or on the side of the road. Alex was left, as far as we know, in a cardboard box at an intersection. So you take a child who's already been abandoned once, and then you abandon them again.
Proprioceptive system, the faculty of perceiving stimuli produced within an organism, especially relating to the position and movement of the body and limbs. Bergson and Huxley's filtering hypothesis suggests that the brain protects humans from overload. However, this protective function of the brain does not seem to work in autism. Bergson provided profound explanations of some features we find in autistic perception and the reasons why normal neurotypical people do not possess the superabilities that are quite common in autism, though these super abilities often bring a lot of frustration and anxiety to those involved. And this is why we autistics do the stimming. I love to stim with any form of sheepskin. It's just so soft. Wonderful. It is a way to calm our system, to regulate. The hypothesis that individuals with autism do not have adequate filtering of sensory information seems to account for the peculiarities of sensory perceptual functioning in autism, other developmental disabilities, and normal functioning in atypical circumstances. Autistic individual senses seem to be either too open or not open enough. Too open means they have no filter. For an autistic, being in a crowd of people, it's too much information. And you feel exhausted from that. And a meltdown can be a result, or a shutdown. Not open enough means that not enough sensory stimulation comes through. Both scenarios lead to sensory deprivation. In the first one, this is self-imposed sensory deprivation, whereby individuals shut down the sensory channels to protect themselves from sensory flooding. Autism is a classic example of withdrawal. Autistic children seem to be able to turn off one or more of their senses. It can be their protective strategy. When they cannot cope with flooding sensory information, they may shut down some or all sensory channels. For example, many autistic children are suspected of being deaf, as they sometimes do not react to even loud sounds, and many are referred to hearing tests as early as 5 or 6 months of age. Their hearing, however, is often even more acute than average, but they learn to switch it off when they experience information overload. I still do that. I suddenly found myself being completely tuned off and have no idea what has been said. When sensory input becomes too intense and often painful, shutting off the sensory channels helps the child to withdraw into his or her own world. It's a way to protect yourself. Especially when I feel very tired after hours in a train. Then I tend to tune out very quickly. And my brain gets very tired and is not able to take in any form of information. And then also talking becomes difficult because it takes a lot of energy to concentrate on what you want to say, and sometimes that effort is difficult when you already feel so overwhelmed from all the noise and sensory input around you. So there is no other way, you just tune out. It is as though the eyes stop seeing and the ears stop listening. Temple Grandin hypothesizes that by doing this, the autistic child creates his or her own self-imposed sensory deprivation that leads to secondary central nervous system abnormalities that happen as a result of the autistic child's avoidance of input. Auditory and tactile input often overwhelmed me. Loud noise hurt my ears. When noise and sensory stimulation become too intense, I was able to shut off my hearing and retreat into my own world. So you see, this is really very different. One is sensory overload withdrawal, and the other is the result of trauma. The impact of neglect, which then will show as pseudo-autism.